All right, so get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into something, oh, well, honestly, it's a pretty heavy topic. We're going to be looking at how the U.S. prison system has basically become the default mental health care provider for so many people.
Yeah, it's definitely a big issue and one that we need to really understand, I think. When
Sure.
you hear that, and almost 500,000 people with mental illnesses are actually behind bars
Yeah.
compared to, a mere 50,000 in psychiatric hospitals. It's
Yeah,
pretty shocking.
it's mind-boggling. It's like 10 times the number. So how do we even get to this point? I mean, prisons aren't exactly known for being like therapeutic
Well,
environment.
to understand how we got here, we kind of have to go back a few decades
Hmm.
and look at this policy of deinstitutionalization. It started in the 1950s
Hmm.
and really gained momentum in the 80s. The idea was to shift people from these large, often very impersonal state-run psychiatric hospitals
Hmm.
into smaller community-based settings.
Okay, so in theory, that sounds good, right? More humane,
Mhm.
more personalized care. So what went wrong?
Well, the problem was that there was a serious lack of resources in those communities. They just weren't equipped to handle the influx of people that needed intensive mental health care.
So it's kind of like we're saying, all right, everybody out of the pool. But we forgot to fill the pool with water first.
Yeah. It's a good analogy. The intention was good,
Mm.
but the execution was flawed.
Right. And so instead of getting the support that they needed, a lot of these people ended up in crisis situations. And then who do they call? They called the police.
Exactly. Police officers basically become the de facto first responders to mental health crises.
Right.
But are police officers trained to handle someone experiencing a psychotic episode?
Right.
Not usually.
Yeah, it's like asking a plumber to fix your electrical wiring.
Yeah, exactly.
So instead of getting treatment, they end up in jail.
And then that kind of leads us into this other huge problem. You've got prisons, which are designed for punishment and security,
Right.
now housing this massive population of people with serious mental health needs.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah. And prisons are built to confine and control, not to heal and rehabilitate.
Oh, yeah.
You can't just slap a Band-Aid on this issue. We're talking about people with complex conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression. These need specialized care from trained professionals.
It's almost like we're setting them up for failure. Instead of getting better, they're thrust into this environment that can actually make their symptoms worse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The stress, the isolation, the lack of proper treatment, all of those factors can exacerbate existing conditions
Mm.
and even trigger new ones.
And I think the source material even mentioned that. A study by the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that over 50% of inmates in state prisons actually report having a mental health condition.
That's right. And
Um,
and guess what? Those with mental illnesses are more likely to be placed in solitary confinement, which is basically the opposite of a therapeutic environment.
yeah, it's a vicious cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because they don't get the treatment they need, so their symptoms get worse. And then they end up getting punished for behaviors that are driven by their illness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a really tragic situation.
And going through the source material, there was one case that really stood out to me. The story of Robert Bankston.
Yeah, I remember that one too. That one was really, really powerful.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of this systemic failure.
He was incarcerated for robbery in 1989
Yeah.
and suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. But here's the thing. In prison, his condition actually deteriorated
Yeah.
due to the lack of proper care.
Rush.
He would have these violent outbursts, bang his head against the wall, and experience these intense delusions.
Yeah, and the source even describes him like smearing feces on the walls of his cell. I mean, it's a gut-wrenching image, but it speaks volumes about how desperate he must have felt.
It's a really sad story. And unfortunately, his story isn't unique. There are countless others just like him, languishing in prisons that are ill-equipped to handle their needs.
Right. It's clear that something has to change. But what are the solutions? I mean, are there any glimmers of hope out there?
There are definitely some glimmers of hope out there.
Uh,
The source actually mentions some promising reforms happening in Ohio.
oh, yeah, they're creating those specialized mental health units within the prisons, right?
Exactly. Those units are specifically designed to house inmates with mental illnesses, offering dedicated staff that are actually trained in mental health care.
So instead of guards with batons, you've got therapists with clipboards.
Well, not quite, but
Yeah.
it's a step in the right direction. The idea is to provide a more therapeutic environment with access to medication counseling and other support services.
Okay, but how effective can these units really be when they're still within the confines of a prison? You know, it's still a system that's built on punishment and control.
Yeah, that's a valid point. It's like trying to grow a delicate flower in a concrete parking lot. The environment itself can be a barrier to healing. But even with those limitations, it's encouraging to see that some states are at least acknowledging the need for that specialized care.
Yeah, it's definitely a start. But the source also points out that Ohio is just one state. We need to see that systemic change on a national level if we're going to make a real dent in this problem.
Absolutely, and that brings us back to the root of the issue, that severe lack of accessible, quality mental health care in communities. That's what pushes people into these crisis situations,
Hmm.
where law enforcement becomes the only option.
It's like we're waiting for the dam to break. Before we even think about fixing the cracks, we
Exactly.
need to invest in prevention and early intervention.
Imagine if we had, you know, robust community mental health centers in every neighborhood, offering affordable therapy,
Right.
crisis intervention teams that are trained in de-escalation techniques, supportive housing programs that understand the needs of people with mental illnesses.
I mean, it sounds like a utopia,
Yeah,
but it's actually a necessity.
it is.
We can't keep relying on prisons to do a job they're not equipped for.
Right. It's like expecting a firefighter to also be a brain surgeon.
Hmm.
We need those specialized professionals in the right settings to address this complex issue.
So let's say we start making those investments in community-based care. What happens to the people that are already incarcerated, struggling with mental illness? What does real change look like for them?
That's where things get really nuanced. Remember, we're not talking about a monolithic group here. Every individual has their own unique needs and challenges.
So how do we even begin to address such a diverse range of needs within a system as rigid as the prison system?
It's a huge challenge, no doubt. But there are some key principles that should guide any reform efforts. First and foremost, we need access to qualified mental health professionals. Not just a handful, but a sufficient number of psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and nurses who are specifically trained to work with this population.
So we need to attract and retain talent in a setting that's not exactly known for being a mental health haven.
Right. It's going to take a serious commitment from policymakers and prison administrators
Uh-huh.
to make those positions attractive and to create a supportive work environment.
Okay, so let's say we've got the staff. What's next?
Individualized treatment plans. Just like outside of prison, each person needs a care plan. That's tailored to their specific diagnosis, symptoms, and goals. That could include medication management, therapy group support, and skills training to help them cope with daily life.
So it's about recognizing that they're not just inmates. They're human beings with individual needs and aspirations.
Exactly. And here's another crucial piece of the puzzle. Trauma-informed care. You see, many people with mental illnesses have experienced trauma, particularly those who've been through the criminal justice system. Their experiences need to be acknowledged and addressed in their treatment to promote true healing.
It's like treating a wound without cleaning it first. You can bandage it up, but it won't heal properly unless you address that underlying infection.
That's a great analogy. And finally, we can't overlook the importance of creating safe and therapeutic environments. Within prisons, we've already talked about how the typical prison environment can be detrimental to mental health. With its sensory overload, lack of privacy, and that constant threat of violence.
Yeah, it's like trying to recover from a broken leg in a mosh pit. It's just not conducive to healing.
Exactly. So we need to rethink the design of mental health units within prisons. Think natural light calming colors, quiet spaces for reflection, and opportunities for meaningful activities.
So moving away from the cold, sterile, and often chaotic atmosphere that many associate with prisons.
Precisely. It's about creating spaces that feel humane, safe, and supportive of recovery. But here's a question for you. How do we measure success? How do we know if these reforms are actually making a difference?
That's a good question. It can't just be about reducing the number of incidents, right? I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are getting better.
Right, we need to look at deeper indicators, like engagement in treatment. Are people attending therapy sessions? Are they taking their medication as prescribed? Are they participating in programs? We also need to track improvements in mental health symptoms. Are they reporting feeling less depressed, anxious, or paranoid? Are they better able to manage their emotions and cope with stress?
Yeah, it's about giving them the tools to build a better life, both
Yeah.
inside and outside of prison.
Exactly. And that brings us to a crucial point. We can't just focus on reforming the prison system. We have to address the root causes of why so many people with mental illness end up there in the first place.
So back to prevention and early intervention.
Absolutely. If we can provide adequate mental health support in communities, reduce the stigma surrounding these conditions, and create pathways to treatment that don't involve the criminal justice system, then we can truly turn the tide.
It's a big challenge, but it feels like a necessary one. We're talking about fundamental human rights here. The right to health, the right to dignity, the right to live a life free from needless suffering.
Well said. And it's going to take a collective effort from policymakers, mental health professionals, advocates, and communities to bring about this change.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the historical context of deinstitutionalization to the complex challenges of providing mental health care within prisons. It's a multifaceted issue with no easy answers.
It's fascinating because there's no single solution that will magically fix everything. It's going to require a combination of approaches tailored to specific communities and individuals, along with a willingness to constantly evaluate and adapt our strategies.
And that's where our listeners come in. We've provided a lot of information today. But it's not just about passive listening, it's about engaging with these ideas, asking tough questions, and advocating for change in your own communities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question. How can we as individuals and as a society advocate for a system that prioritizes mental health care over punishment, compassion over judgment, and rehabilitation over retribution? It's a question worth pondering, and one that deserves our continued attention and action.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll sign off for today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and keep those conversations going. It's amazing how this whole conversation keeps coming back to the idea of systemic change. It's not just about, tweaking a few things here and there. We're talking about, a fundamental shift
Yeah.
in how we view and treat mental illness.
Yeah, it really is. It's like we've built this massive ship and we're trying to steer in a new direction, but the rudder is rusty, the sails are torn, and the crew isn't quite sure where we're headed.
Yeah.
It's going to take a lot of work to get this thing moving in the right direction.
And it's not just about getting the ship moving. It's about making sure we don't hit any icebergs along the way.
I may.
Even with the best intentions, there are always potential downsides and unintended consequences to consider. Absolutely. That's why it's so crucial to think critically about the solutions that we're proposing. For example, we've talked a lot about increasing funding for community-based mental health care,
Yeah.
which is obviously essential.
Yeah.
But we have to be mindful of how those resources are actually distributed. We don't want to create a system where only certain groups benefit while others are left behind.
Right. It's like building a bridge that only reaches halfway across the river. It's not going to help those who are stuck on the other side.
Right.
We need to make sure that everyone has equitable access to care, regardless of their background, their income, or their zip code.
Exactly. And there's another layer to this: data privacy. As we increase data collection and sharing among mental health providers, law enforcement, and other agencies, it's crucial to have those robust safeguards in place to protect individual privacy.
Because the last thing we want is for people to be afraid to seek help because they're worried about their information being misused or ending up in the wrong hands. Like going to the doctor and worrying that your medical records will be plastered on a billboard.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about protecting privacy, it's also about avoiding coercion. While we want to encourage people to seek treatment, we also need to respect individual autonomy.
Right.
We can't force people into care against their will unless they pose a clear and imminent danger to themselves or others.
It's a tricky balance, right? Because on the one hand, you want to help people that are struggling, but on the other hand, you don't want to create a system that feels oppressive or punitive.
It is.
It's like walking a tightrope between compassion and control.
Well said. And those same complexities also apply when we talk about those specialized mental health units within prisons. While they can offer more focused care, there's also the risk of further isolating and stigmatizing individuals with mental illness.
Right. It's like creating a separate world within the prison walls, which could reinforce the idea that these individuals are somehow fundamentally different or dangerous.
Exactly. And we have to be very careful about how these units are designed and operated to avoid creating that sense of segregation or punishment. The focus needs to be on creating a genuinely therapeutic environment that promotes healing and rehabilitation.
And that kind of brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, alternatives to incarceration. We've talked about things like mental health courts and diversion programs, but how do we ensure that these programs are effective and don't just become another revolving door back into the system?
That's the million-dollar question. It's going to require a fundamental shift in our thinking about crime and punishment. We need to move away from a purely punitive approach and embrace a more rehabilitative model that recognizes those complex factors that contribute to criminal behavior.
It's like realizing that a cough isn't the disease, it's a symptom. We need to treat the underlying condition, not just suppress the outward signs.
That's a great way to put it. And that shift in thinking needs to happen at all levels of the justice system. From police officers on the street to judges in the courtroom, they need the training, the resources, and the support to
Hmm.
make informed decisions that prioritize rehabilitation over retribution.
So it's not just about having alternatives to prison. It's about changing the entire mindset around justice and accountability.
Absolutely.
And that's a huge undertaking. But it's a necessary one if we want to create a system that truly serves the needs of all its citizens.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive today. We've covered a lot of ground, explored some really complex issues, and hopefully sparked some thought-provoking conversations along the way.
It's been quite a journey, but as we always say, the learning doesn't stop here. We encourage you to continue exploring this topic, asking questions, and engaging with your communities to advocate for positive change.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about statistics or policies. It's about real people's lives.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play in creating a more just and compassionate world for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of a topic that matters.